Yes, lovely. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this midday webinar during your lunch break. So this webinar is dedicated to the city of Liverpool and the representation of ethnic minorities in the Remain campaign, and more specifically in the pro-European grassroots movement. I would like to thank Mr. Latour as well as Mr. Garbay for their help with the organization and for providing such a great platform to talk about ethnic diversity, race and migration in the British Isles. So we are thrilled to have Sam Wetherell with us today. Hello, Sam.
Hello.
Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for squeezing in this webinar between two classes. We really appreciate it. So a few words about you, Sam. So you are a senior lecturer in the history of Britain and the world at the University of York, and you specialize in urban history, decolonization, and histories of culture and art making. We are delighted to have you today, and you are going to present your second book, Liverpool and the Unmaking of Britain, which was published earlier this year by Bloomsbury Publishing. And your book deals with a new history of Britain told through the city of Liverpool. So your presentation is today is entitled Decolonisation, Public Health and Black Political Organising in Post-War Liverpool. So I'm sure we are all going to learn a great deal about this city. So make sure you have some questions to ask him after his presentation, as we will be taking questions after each presentation. So just before you start, a quick word about me. So I'm Marie Aouanes Perrière. I'm a doctor in British Studies and affiliated with the Center for Anglophone Studies at Toulouse-Jean Jaurès University. I wrote my doctoral thesis on the pro-European grassroots mobilization against Brexit. And today my research revolves around pro-European grassroots initiatives and their impact on British politics. Without further ado, let's hear about your work, Sam. The stage is all yours. You have 20 minutes, I think.
Fantastic. Let me share my screen.
I'll just put
Hopefully
my
this
microphone
will
on
work.
mute.
Can people now see, I think if I start the slideshow.
Yeah, it's
We can all see your
actually.
PowerPoint. Yeah.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Brilliant. Okay, so lovely to be here. Well, obviously, remotely be here in the most broadly defined way possible. And thank you so much, Marie, for putting this together. So what I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes is present some research from my book, which Marie very kindly introduced, which is called Liverpool and the Unmaking of Britain. Here it is. So the idea of this book is to tell a story about post-war Britain through the history of a single city, in this instance, Liverpool. And in doing so, I'm interested in how we can tell a new kind of history of Britain, one that foregrounds themes such as decolonisation, deindustrialisation, racial inequality, radical political movements, and ecological ruin. The overarching theme of the book is obsolescence, which is basically what does it mean to live in a place that has outlasted the historical forces that has conjured it into being. And today I'm going to be focusing on, there's many different parts of the book I could focus on, but I thought I would talk about the transformation of public health in Liverpool as a way into some of these bigger questions. The transformation of public health as the city decolonized and deindustrialized in the second half of the 20th century. And I'm going to argue that the emergence of new networks of care in the city and support in the wake of this massive transformation can help us think more expansively about histories of health in the post-war period, hopefully not just in Britain, but perhaps also elsewhere. But I do want to begin by noting that there has been a lot of fantastic recent work on healthcare and race in Britain, and that much of this work is dominated by the history of the National Health Service, or the NHS, which was the integrated universal healthcare service created in Britain in 1948. Now, the NHS occupies, for those who have spent much time in Britain will know this, a very special, almost romantic place in British people's imaginations. It was once described as the closest thing the British have to a national religion. And this is a still from the 2012 opening ceremony for the 2012 London Olympics, in which hundreds, possibly thousands of nurses spelled out the word NHS in the middle of the opening ceremony in front of an audience of nearly 1 billion people at the center of the London Olympic Stadium. Yes, and so far, most of our histories of race and healthcare in Britain have been shaped by the National Health Service, kind of for obvious reasons. And there are historians here such as Andrew Seaton, Roberta Bevins, as well as activist networks such as the Young Historians Project. All of these people have focused on the really important task of recovering the experiences and lives of the doctors, the nurses, and porters who worked in the National Health Service, who were migrants from Britain's current and former empire in the decades immediately after the war. Other historians, such as Grace Redhead, have looked at Black activism within the National Health Service to improve treatment for diseases such as sickle cell anemia. And so then, for obvious reasons, the NHS has cast a long shadow over these questions of the relationship between healthcare and race and empire in post-war Britain. But what I'm going to do today is kind of depart from that. I'm going to sketch out how the history of Liverpool from the 1940s to the 1980s helps us tell a story about decolonisation and healthcare that goes beyond institutional histories of the National Health Service and its workforce. And I'm going to do this in 3 parts. So part 1, we're going to look at Liverpool as a global epidemiological border that needed to be managed on public health grounds in the 40s and 50s. Part 2, we're going to talk about how deindustrialization and the unmaking of Liverpool's imperial maritime economy produced new kinds of healthcare inequalities. And then finally, we're going to look at new activist healthcare groups that formed in the city to deinstitutionalize the provision of care. And I'll talk about what deinstitutionalization and deinstitutionalizing care means when we get there. So for much of its modern history, healthcare in Liverpool has followed the rhythms of the city's imperial maritime economy. And for much of the 20th century, Liverpool was Britain's second largest port and subsequently one of the major cities of empire. The city was therefore caught in the middle of a global epidemiological whirlpool, exposed to the viruses and other ailments that circulated among transient seafarers, migrants, and animals, dead or alive, as they moved between ports on every continent on Earth. In other words, the city's public health landscape was inseparable from its status as one of Britain's most trafficked borders. As late as the 1940s and 1950s, the chief medical officer of the port was tasked with managing and containing the tropical diseases that washed up on the city's shores. In the first 2 years after World War II, Liverpool saw cases of diphtheria, typhoid fever, amoebic dysentery, bacillary dysentery, and leprosy, all of which arrived through the port, carried by the crew or the passengers of intercontinental ships. Smallpox stowed away on ships to wreak havoc in Liverpool long after the disease had been effectively eliminated in Britain in the 1930s. In 1946, the city saw a minor epidemic of smallpox, totaling 30 cases. And Betty Braddock, who was the MP for Liverpool, or the MP for the Liverpool Exchange constituency, repeatedly in Parliament called for stringent quarantine measures and harsh punishments for those who'd been exposed to the illness but refused vaccination. Malaria, meanwhile, was a persistent problem in Liverpool, but in nowhere else in Britain, with 200 to 300 cases a year recorded and treated in the city. Chinese sailors in Hong Kong, when they were signing on for work on Liverpool ships, were subjected to rigorous health screenings at their home port, with tuberculosis and venereal disease a particular concern. And diseases lived in goods as well as people. The processing of animal products meant that dock workers were sometimes exposed to anthrax, usually a few cases each year. And in the immediate post-war decades, the containment of these diseases prompted scenes that were a curious mix of the post-war modern and the Victorian Gothic. Ill sailors laid low aboard ships from tropical outposts were collected at the port by ambulances and quarantined in new National Health Service hospitals in the city's suburbs. At the same time, port medical authorities feared even greater monsters. In 1947, a massive cholera outbreak in Egypt meant that all ships that had passed through Egyptian ports had to have their drinking water sterilized and their fresh produce destroyed on arrival in Liverpool. Fear of psittacosis, an acute respiratory disease carried by tropical birds, meant that ships had to be inspected for parrots, which were destroyed if discovered. And more frightening still was the prospect of bubonic plague. The last case of bubonic plague in Liverpool was in 1926, when a watchman on the docks was stricken with the disease. And it was fear of plague in particular which motivated the port's elaborate battles with rats, both on arriving ships and on the docks. The Merseyside Dock and Harbour Board loaded and emptied 160 traps and 155 poison baits each day. And in the immediate post-war years, between 20,000 and 25,000 rats were killed each year by an army of professional rat catchers, and all of these rats were diligently recorded by the chief medical officer, where they were killed, what type of rat they were, when they were killed, etc. So beginning in the 1950s, this complex public health landscape, shaped by the city's status as a leading port, was obliterated. The decline of Liverpool's maritime economy in the 1960s and 1970s as the city's docks were destroyed by containerization, as decolonisation disrupted the networks of trade that had sustained the city, as the country's borders moved inland away from docks and towards airports. All of this led to a more parochial, microbial environment for the city. And this is the second part of the talk. The country's goods enclosed in sterile metal containers were handled by fewer and fewer workers. The dramatic fall in the number of malaria patients recorded in the city from 261 in 1948 to just 3 in 1973 tells its own story about Liverpool's post-war deglobalization. And the unmaking of Liverpool's maritime economy, a process driven by decolonisation, by technological changes in shipping, changing geographies and trade, deindustrialisation and recession, created an entirely new complex of public health crises in Liverpool by the 1980s. By that decade, Liverpool was facing a concatenation of economic, environmental and social crises. Between 1957 and 1983, 7 out of every 8 docking jobs disappeared from the city. And the hundreds of light industrial enterprises which had been hastily erected in the middle of the 20th century to compensate for the city's shrinking economy. These were things like car plants, food processing works, small electronics factories, all attracted to diversify the city's economy as its docks unraveled, were themselves steadily gutted by the recessions of the 1970s and 1980s. Between 1979 and 1982 alone, in this 3-year window, Merseyside, the area around Liverpool, saw an amazing 384 factories close for good, taking with them more than 25,000 jobs. And throughout the 1980s, between 15 and 20% of the city remained permanently unemployed. And this gets back to my point about obsolescence. The engines of industry and trade that had once made Liverpool a wealthy city of almost 1 million people had sputtered and died. And as a result, a new set of public health crises emerged. These were, I argue, public health crises symptomatic of a declining rather than a dominant economy. They were crises that were produced by obsolescence. So what were these crises? By 1980, according to almost any measure, Liverpool was less healthy than Britain as a whole. In 1981, the city's overall mortality rate was found to be 10% higher than the rest of England and Wales. Rates of respiratory cancer, blood disease, brain damage, and pneumonia were 30% higher in Liverpool than the average. And rates of heart disease were 20% higher, rates of breast cancer 10% higher. A 2017 survey of 6 English cities, which included Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield, found that since 1981, Liverpool has had the highest prevalence of deaths from drugs and alcohol, a leading indicator of what some economists have recently referred to as deaths of despair, common in post-industrial communities across the global north. In fact, other than congenital anomalies, the only mortality indicator in which Liverpool fared better than the rest of the country in 1980 was the number of people dying in car accidents. a figure explained by the fact that the city's poverty had resulted in lower rates of car ownership. For people of colour in Liverpool, things were even worse. The city's substantial Black and Chinese populations has a very distinctive history. These two communities were mostly descendants of West African and Chinese seafarers who'd been employed as cheap labour on intercontinental steamships. The unravelling of the city's maritime economy had meant that the predominant experience of people of colour in Liverpool from the late 19th century was one of unemployment and abandonment rather than exploitation. In the early 1980s, the unemployment rates in parts of the city with the highest concentration of Black settlement was estimated to be as high as 73%. The city's Black population were concentrated by the racist logic of both the private housing market and the council's public housing department into a small neighbourhood in the south of Liverpool called Toxteth, where they were heavily and often violently policed. So as with housing and employment, the city's Black population had long held a subordinate position within Britain's health service. A 1980 investigation found that people of colour of all class backgrounds had significantly higher mortality rates than white residents of England and Wales, for example. That was a national picture. And racial inequalities in healthcare systems were felt acutely by the elderly Black population in Liverpool, who were all but excluded from care homes and other support services in the post-war period. In 1983, a major report from the city's social services department contained some truly astonishing headline figures. There were only 7 Black elders in the city's 1,143 council-owned elderly care homes. And of the 4,553 elderly people in the city using the free council-run Meals on Wheels food service, basically a free food delivery service, only 9, not 9%, just 9 of these people were Black. These inequalities were particularly consequential for the city's small but established Somali community. Most of Liverpool's Somali seamen had arrived in a single cohort during the 1950s to make up for labour shortages on British ships. And by 1985, an investigation into this community found that its small population had high numbers of single, elderly, and very isolated men. As practicing Muslims, most of the men had been unable to eat the food provided in the Meals on Wheels service and were dependent on various local charities for housing and social activities. So this gets to my final point of the talk then, part 3. In the face of this hostile and unequal post-colonial public health landscape, activists forged their own networks of care. In 1980s Liverpool saw an explosion of alternative caregiving networks which operated outside of the National Health Service. So in the book, I write about AIDS support networks organized primarily by gay men, as well as insurgent needle exchange services which served heroin addicts and sex workers, which operated technically outside the bounds of the law. And I'm very happy to talk about these groups in the questions, but in this presentation, I'm going to focus on groups organized by Black activists in the city. And here the lead was taken by, oh, sorry, I haven't been updating the slides. So this is basically some of the statistics that I've already been through outlining Liverpool's late 20th century public health crisis. And then this is some of the extraordinary statistics about Black elderly care. Again, even more dramatic given Black people make up 5 to 8% of the city's population during this period. So here the lead was taken by the South African sociologist and healthcare activist Protasia Torkington. In 1980, Torkington was one of the founders of a group called the Liverpool Racial Minority Health Group. As well as gathering data on racial health inequalities and lobbying officials, the group performed their own DIY forms of care. Torkington and her colleagues set up a regular blood pressure screening service in the city's Caribbean Centre. The group worked with the isolated community of Somali women in the city to help build bridges between them and a healthcare service that had been hostile to some of their specific religious needs. They also helped setting up a translating and interpreting service to work across the health authority, helping speakers of 10 different languages. And actually, Particularly Mandarin was incredibly important here. The city had a very established Chinese population, but was increasingly isolated and struggled to access really any forms of a welfare state because of profound language barriers. Meanwhile, in 1983, two Black women founded an organization called Priority, which ran support groups to boost confidence in dealing with the NHS, the National Health Service, and articulating health problems to doctors. This was also the aim of an organization called Mary Seacole House, named after a Black nurse who served in the Crimean War, which emerged out of a drop-in clinic run by the Liverpool Black Sisters, a Black feminist activist group in the late 1980s. This house was founded specifically to offer help to Black people suffering mental health problems. It offered emergency treatment, but also help with navigating the often punitive and labyrinthine systems of care. So the need to form new practices of care outside the NHS in Liverpool was in part necessitated by the unusually low number of Black healthcare workers in the city, a product of the city's intensely racially segregated labour market. I kind of gestured to the beginning how many nurses and porters in Britain, particularly in the decades immediately after the Second World War, were colonial and post-colonial migrants. This was not the case in Liverpool, which had a much more racially segregated labour market. In 1982, out of 170 student nurses in training, only 2 were Black. Remember that the Black population of the city was 5 to 8%. And there were no Black nurses in Liverpool working above the level of ward sister, which is sort of the lowest rung of the profession. Like many Black critics of Britain's care infrastructure, Pretasia Torkington forged a radical critique of the NHS. In her book, The Racial Politics of Health, she argued that the National Health Service should be viewed less through the lens of care and more as an instrument for disciplining bodies and maximizing productivity, treating people, in her words, as, quotes, mere productive units and focusing on individual rather than structural or environmental causes for illness. This argument was made by a number of Black activists in the 1980s, perhaps most notably in 1985 by Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, and Susan Scaife, as well as a number of other members of the Brixton Black Women's Group in their book, The Heart of the Race. Similar to Torkington, these writers identified the purpose of the National Health Service as being to, quote, replenish the labour supply with fit white male workers. They wrote, since we were never identified as potential consumers of the service, our health needs did not enter the debate about the kind of health provision the country would establish. The NHS was geared first and foremost to meeting the needs of the white man as economic producer, and to a lesser extent those of the white woman as reproducer. These priorities have remained enshrined within the NHS ever since. They are reflected in every facet of the service, from the allocation of its resources to the structure of its workforce. As such, our treatment within the NHS is probably the most clear and damning indictment of our social and economic value in Britain. Okay, so to conclude, what I've offered here is a sketch of how we can think about healthcare and public health in colonial and post-colonial Britain since 1945 as a story that is much bigger than the formation and transformation of the National Health Service. And I've shown, more importantly, how Liverpool's status as an imperial trading hub necessitated one particular kind of public health landscape, while its deglobalization and deindustrialization in the later 20th century created a host of new kinds of public health problems and inequalities, driven by poverty, unemployment, and obsolescence. In the face of this transformation, I have argued that Liverpool's Black population, particularly Black women, organized networks of care that were critical of and acted outside of the National Health Service. Understanding this helps us get beyond mythologies of the National Health Service, which tend to be highly nationalist and often drenched in sentiment and nostalgia, as we saw at the beginning of this talk. To use a term from a historian of welfare, Melinda Cooper, who has written about gay men's AIDS support groups in 1980s America, Black activists in Liverpool oversaw a radical deinstitutionalization of care, i.e., taking care out of the previously seen as coercive or perhaps unhelpful institutions in which it had been embedded, and its remaking on new terms. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was very insightful, actually, about Liverpool's history. Maybe we can take some questions. I'll let Vincent or Romain take the questions.
Yeah, if I can go first, if that's okay with everyone.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Sam. I thought that was a very, very interesting and insightful presentation. I'm always happy to hear some or to hear or read some local history, urban history about British cities. So I'm really glad there are historians like you doing this kind of work, and especially Liverpool that I'm not so familiar with. And so precisely because of that, I'm a bit curious as to why, if I understood what you said correctly, Liverpool, I mean, clearly had a quite established tradition as a colonial port with a small but long-standing settlement of colonial workers. So you talked about Africans and you talked about the Chinese. Um, but paradoxically, it seems it's also a city where there were less people, less post-colonial or post-colonial migrant workers recruited to work in the NHS than elsewhere in Britain. So you insisted several times on the fact that the labor market in Liverpool was more segregated racially than in other places. So it seems paradoxical since it had a tradition of being a colonial port with a slightly more mixed population than elsewhere. Or is it linked? Or
Well, so I think there's a few different answers to that question.
mm,
It is kind of a puzzle. I think the first thing to say is that most of the people of color working in Britain's National Health Service arrived after 1948. And 1948 was a really significant moment in transforming Britain's border regime. Basically, a new Nationalities Act was passed, which granted equal citizenship to everybody within Britain's empire. This only lasted for a 12-year window. It was rescinded in 1962, sorry, a 14-year window. But what it meant, and this is called the sort of Windrush window, named after the ship, the first, well, it was technically the third, but remembered as the first ship that cohorts of Caribbean migrants arrived, is that this was the period in which other parts of Britain, not Liverpool, which had always been
mm,
a multiracial formation,
mm,
and small parts of London, small parts of Cardiff, small parts of Liverpool, so small parts of
mm,
Bristol. But the
mm,
rest of Britain became a truly multiracial, multicultural society as
mm,
hundreds of thousands of migrants, specifically from the Caribbean and South Asia, arrived in Britain. And it was this cohort which formed, that was recruited to work for the NHS in particular, to do low-paid work in the NHS. Um, the reason why Liverpool didn't have that same story is that very few of this Windrush moment of migration ended up in Liverpool. Many in the early stages arrived by ship into Liverpool, but very few stayed longer than a few weeks. They were dispersed out of the
mm,
country, and it was partly for two different reasons. One, the city was facing an enormous, almost permanent throughout the 20th century economic crisis, for which working opportunities were just not there. But two, the city's very established black population, which had arrived much earlier and through shipping networks, were had basically was under siege by sort of various forms of white racism in the city. It was an extremely hostile place to be a
mm,
black person in Liverpool. It was described in the 1980s in the Gifford Inquiry as a form of racism that was uniquely horrific compared to the rest of the city, rest of
oh
the
dear.
country. And so, partly for that reason, that cohort never settled in Liverpool. That was why the labour market was so segmented. But also, it meant that that Liverpool's black population was overwhelmingly male, or the children descended from mixed race families,
Mm,
because very few women of color ended up in the city because it was mainly
mm,
black and Chinese workers. So those are some explanations, but it's still a bit
okay.
of a puzzle. The extremity of the numbers
Mm,
are truly fascinating. Yeah.
thanks. That opens up a lot of avenues for inquiry and yeah, thanks.
I had more. Thank
Mm,
you very much for a very
mm,
stimulating and very interesting presentation. Actually, I would love to read your book. I think I will. I'd be on top of my you know, list in the recent future. No, it's just I'm really interested in the paradox because I mean it's obvious that the NHS, which was created by the Attlee administration in the period you described, post 1945, which saw, I mean, the framing of the NHS, of British welfare, plus, as you said, the framing of immigration legislation through the British Nationality Act. Well, I've always heard, but that right from the beginning, the NHS actually relied heavily on overseas staff, including from the early 1950s onwards. So what I find fascinating is the paradox you highlight. That is the hiring of people from overseas, notably Caribbean nurses or maybe African nurses and other staff, and the sort of systemic. Well, I don't know if it's systemic is the right word, but the maybe the implicit or the I don't know how to put it, the exclusion of patients that clearly were not defined as the core of the target for the NHS. I find that paradox really extremely interesting, and my question was similar to that put by Romain. I wanted to know whether what you observed in Liverpool in terms of the underrepresentation of, Black or other ethnic minority staff within the NHS, is that something that could be observed in London as well, for example? Or was the situation less obvious in London than it was in Liverpool?
As in the situation being the denigrated treatment of Black patients within the National Healthcare Service. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was something that was a major topic of Black activism, particularly Black feminist activism in the 1970s and 1980s. And the collective whose quote that I ended with, Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, Susan Scaife, who co-wrote this extraordinary book about Black feminism in Britain, they were based in South London, so they weren't. They weren't coming out of Liverpool. It was absolutely the case, all forms of healthcare, not just where healthcare outcomes structurally worse because of because of the experience of super exploitation creates its own forms of public health problems, but also diseases that were specific to the Black community, particularly sickle cell disease, were basically misidentified, mistreated. The doctors, ignored patients or were baffled by them. So that there's a historian called Grace Redhead who has looked at the ways that that sickle cell disease that became a sort of site of Black activism, in the later post-war period. So absolutely, this was not something that was confined to London. Sorry, confined to Liverpool. Unlike the story of this very Liverpool specific story of a segmented labour market. I think Nada had a question.
Yeah, I think, yeah, she.
Yes,
Go.
I'm going to jump in with a question, and let me first say how I really loved your presentation. I found it fascinating, especially the way you read the broader history of decolonisation through the history of health. And it made me think about my own work on death and its territories, the cemeteries. And I was wondering, have you looked at how the higher rates, mortality rates among ethnic minorities actually translate in the cemeteries of Liverpool? For example, have you seen or have you visited or explored specific cemeteries organized around specific religions or around specific national origins?
That's such a wonderful question. I mean, really, the answer is I haven't thought about this, but it is a really interesting avenue of inquiry. And actually, I don't know the answer about about specific ways that the minoritized populations of Liverpool treated and tended their dead. I had this fantasy that I would include a big chapter in the book on religion. Um, and obviously there's a very big story about a city dominated by Irish migration, for which sectarian divides between Catholic and Protestant were really live in the city, but were dying away by the time that I start writing about it. But I think there's also I think the other thing that's really striking about religion in Liverpool is that so many of the Anglican churches and Catholic churches that were built in the late 19th and early 20th century, many of them had to be abandoned as the city depopulated, right? A city lost a third of its population in a 20-year period between 1960 and 1980. So Liverpool is strikingly full of these empty churches. And so I wanted to write about that. I didn't, the book is already too long. I just did not have the space to write about it. But that question of, I write a little bit about death. One of my two PhD supervisors was Thomas Lacour, who I'm sure you know as the great cultural historian of death. And so I'm surprised that he didn't talk to me, tell me more to talk about this. I actually quote that book and Thomas Lacour in the context of the way that the city memorialized those that died of AIDS in the city through a sort of a sort of AIDS quilt, its own sort of AIDS quilt movement in the early 90s. And then also memorialized for people that died in the Hillsborough disaster, which was a really huge football stadium disaster in 1989. And how these two different projects came together. There was a sort of a work of the dead and memory in this moment of real crisis in the city. But all of this is talking around the fact that I don't know the answer to your question, I'm afraid. But it's just such an interesting one. I'm sorry. Yeah, I wish I did. I wish I had something better to say.
Yeah, but thank you for this answer. But it came to mind immediately when you were talking about those high rates, mortality rates, specifically among ethnic minorities.
Yeah.
So what happens to those migrants once they're dead? So they
Yeah.
just disappear.
It's an amazing question.
They should
Yeah.
be somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you anyway.
Of course.
Nada is a leading expert on these issues, so the question sounded natural, but it's obviously. Thank you, Nada, for this question.
Do we have time for another question or not?
Yeah, if we have volunteers, I guess we do.
I have one question. Of course, I'm influenced by my own research. So Sam, I had a question about this activist alternative network. So I wanted to know more about the organization of the groups and to what extent they were successful in treating, ethnic minority patients.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I would say that they seem to be successful on their own terms, particularly in the sense that a lot of the organizations that they set up, places like Mary's Seacole House, continue to exist 40, 50 years later. And many of them have achieved sort of charitable status and endowment. Some of them have been sort of brought into the sort of architecture of welfare now, having emerged as insurgent projects from without, but continue to treat the Black community. I mean, I don't think that they were successful in fully resolving these massive structural inequalities that I was talking about. But it was certainly the case that this constellation of different organizations, the Liverpool Black Sisters, the Liverpool Racial Minority Health Group, I mean, part of the problem is that the other things that they were trying to do was to compensate for the way that a lot of data being gathered on healthcare provision in Liverpool and throughout the post-war period was colorblind. It didn't take race into account. So these were problems that were quite difficult to see. And so they were trying to gather their own data that was part of this project as well. Yeah, I mean, I think, that they obviously didn't resolve these problems, which are very profound and deep and structural, but they certainly, that they certainly achieved an enormous amount. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
I have one final question actually to ask you. You mentioned obviously the racial barrier, right, in terms of preventing ethnic minority people from accessing the NHS, or at least some of the services that were part of the NHS. Now, my question is, you mentioned a racial barrier. Would you say that barrier was more substantial, more significant for Blacks than for Asians? That's A. And B, was there a linguistic element regarding Asians? Because this is something typical in terms of the language barrier affected obviously Asians far more than Afro-Caribbeans who were English speakers. So that's something you found in your research?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that by the mid to late 1980s in Liverpool, as well as across Britain, there was a movement to organize around what became known as political blackness. And this was the idea of taking black as a very, very expansive category. And in Liverpool, this manifested around the Liverpool Black Caucus, which was a sort of political lobbying group affiliated to a number of people that would then become city councillors, which was a sort of the kind of a political voice of the black community through the 1980s. And even though they were called the Liverpool Black Caucus, they saw themselves as trying to unite various different heterogeneous communities of color, for which people, the black community was the largest, but the significant numbers of Chinese communities, South Asian settlers, Yemeni and Middle Eastern, Somalian communities as well. And significant numbers of Malaysian former seafarers as well, actually, in the city. And so, so I think the first thing to say is that often this idea of race as being compartmentalized into different forms of ethnicity and migration was something that these activists were trying to move away from, in the ways that they kept data, in the ways that they organized, in the ways that they fought politically. But I would also say that, it was certainly the case that the biggest groups, the most isolated groups, were arguably Chinese and Somali, particularly older people for whom there were real language barriers. The difference was, though, I think, in terms of everyday experience of kind of marginalization and dispossession, is that these groups tended to be scattered and not concentrated in one place. They weren't as visible. Whereas Liverpool's black community, because of its size, but also its concentration through racist housing policies into a particular neighborhood, remember, they were much more vulnerable to forms of police violence in particular. For police, would inflict, enormous amounts of violence, but culminating in a huge uprising against the police in 1981. But also leaving black people very visible and vulnerable when they left their neighborhood, in a way that Chinese people were able to be a little bit more invisible within the city, or so there were different ways that these experiences manifested, I would say. But obviously language, was a crucial challenge.
Thank you.
I don't know if we have more questions. Okay. Shall we move on?
Yes.
I think you can do your presentation, Marie, if you're ready.
Yes, I am. Well,
Yeah.
first I wanted to thank again Sam for his fascinating presentation about Liverpool. It was it was great. Thank you so much. Yes, I can share my screen. Here it is. Okay. So today I will be presenting a reflection on the representation, or rather a lack thereof, of ethnic minority groups within the anti-Brexit grassroots mobilization. So my presentation draws on empirical research conducted between 2017 and 2021 and seeks to answer a central question: to what extent was the Remain campaign a white middle-class movement that failed to reflect the diversity of British society. So my analysis builds upon interviews with grassroots activists from across the United Kingdom, as well as a review of campaigns such as Ethnic Minorities for a People's Vote. So through this approach, I aim to explore both the structural reasons behind the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities and the symbolic consequences this exclusion had for the legitimacy and inclusiveness of the Remain movement. So the 2016 referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union, as we know, profoundly reshaped the political landscape of the UK. And beyond the economic and constitutional implications, Brexit also revealed deep social and racial fractures. In a country that has long celebrated its multiculturalism, the referendum amplified existing inequalities and legitimized the expression of racism and xenophobia. The months following the vote saw a rise in hate crimes, as though the result had granted permission to discriminate. So while much attention has been given to the divide between Leavers and Remainers, less has been said about how both sides largely ignored ethnic minorities. The voices, the expressions, the experiences and vulnerabilities of these communities, representing over 14% of the UK population, were mostly absent from the political debate. So the paradox is striking. Brexit had profound implications for ethnic minorities, yet they were neither adequately represented in the official campaigns nor actively recruited by pro-European organizations in the years that followed. So this leads to my central question: why were ethnic minorities largely absent from the anti-Brexit resistance? And what does this reveal about the broader social dynamics of the Remain movement? So to understand this absence, it is important to look briefly at the political engagement of ethnic minorities during the referendum. So according to surveys conducted after the vote, a third of ethnic minority voters supported Leave, while around 75% voted to Remain. However, turnout among ethnic minorities was considerably lower, around 54% compared to 74% for white voters. This lower participation has often been interpreted as political disengagement, yet research by the House of Commons Library in 2021 revealed that minorities are in fact more politically active than some of their white counterparts, in many respects. So the problems then, according to Richards and Marshall, was not apathy, but a lack of inclusion and targeted engagement by the Remain campaign. So some activists within the People's Vote movement that I mentioned earlier, such as journalist Nemo Omer, explicitly questioned the overwhelming whiteness of the campaign. As she puts it, the exclusion of ethnic minority voices was not merely a moral oversight, but a tactical error, failing to include a significant segment of the electorate who might have reinforced the pro-European message. So before delving further into the campaign, it is essential to clarify the terminology surrounding ethnic minority identities in Britain. So the acronym BAME, referring to Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, has been widely criticized for its vagueness and for grouping together diverse communities under a single bureaucratic label. So many activists, scholars such as Tariq Mudud or politicians like Trevor Phillips have pointed out that this term homogenizes distinct experiences and identities. As one of my interviewees, Brenda Ashton from Liverpool for Europe, stated, I don't like this term BAME. It's a white construct. It groups everybody together and it isn't inclusive. So the rejection of the term itself already signals the discomfort many activists felt when discussing ethnicity. This linguistic unease often translated into political inaction. Without clear language to describe diversity, the Remain campaign struggled to engage with it meaningfully. So in this presentation, I'll use the term ethnic minority groups, which is clearer and more respectful. And whenever possible, I'll be more specific, for instance, talking about British Pakistanis or Black Caribbean communities. So the Remain resistance that emerged after 2016 was unlike any previous pro-European mobilization in British politics. It consisted of hundreds of loosely structured grassroots groups spread across the country. So such decentralization was in principle conducive to inclusion. As political scientist Laurel Weldon argues, social movements are often the most effective vehicles for representing marginalized groups, precisely because they are flexible and participatory. So yet, in this case, the opposite occurred. Interviews with activists revealed that most local groups were overwhelmingly white and middle class. A survey I conducted in March 2020 among members of Liverpool for Europe found that nearly 89% identified as white. This homogeneity mirrored the broader socio-economic profile of the Remain electorate: urban, educated, professional, and reproduced the same exclusionary dynamics that have long characterized British politics. So within this largely white movement, there was one notable attempt to engage ethnic minorities. It was the creation of Ethnic Minorities for People's Vote, EM4PV, in 2018. So EM4PV was launched under the slogan, "Let us be heard," and aimed to mobilize ethnic minority voters for a vote on the deal. The initiative organized rallies, published articles, and partnered with high-profile activists such as Mead Coburn and Bashir Ibrahim, whom I failed to interview as all my emails were left without a response. However, despite its ambitions, EM4PV failed to connect with the wider network of grassroots groups. When conducted interview, only two of the activists, like Femi Oluwole and members of the 3 Million, were aware of its existence. Others, such as local organizers from Preston for Europe or Liverpool for Europe, admitted they had never heard of it. So this disconnect highlights a deeper structural issue. While the People's Vote campaign sought to appear inclusive, it lacked mechanisms of communication and coordination that would have ensured genuine diversity. So one activist candidly reflected, "We are amateurs, remember, we are grassroots. Nobody told us about EM4PV. We missed a trick." My fieldwork with 6 organizations revealed a spectrum of engagement with diversity. Some groups, such as London for Europe, actively reached out to Sikh and Pakistani communities, hosting talks in East London, Gurdwaras, and community centres. Others, like Britain for All, used inclusive imagery, but admitted they never developed a coherent strategy to involve ethnic minority activists. As for Preston for Europe, the group collaborated with Preston Windrush Generation, therefore focusing on the effect and impact of the Windrush scandal on ethnic minorities. As Brenda Ashton observed, we could have gone to the community centres, to the chip shops, to speak to them, and we didn't. Looking back, we missed an opportunity. So these testimonies expose not just oversight, but also discomfort. Many white activists recognized the problem only retrospectively when confronted with the lack of diversity within their own ranks. So several explanations emerged from this research. First, the Remain campaign prioritized EU citizens' rights, a crucial but largely white constituency, over issues affecting ethnic minority Britons. Second, geography mattered. Groups operating in diverse cities like London had greater opportunities for engagement, while others in less diverse regions did not see ethnic minorities as a natural audience. Third, activist culture played a role. The Remain movement was dominated by university-educated professionals accustomed to liberal technocratic arguments about economics and rights, discourses that did not always resonate with working class or minority communities. And finally, there was an internal fragmentation within the People's Vote coalition, limited its capacity to coordinate inclusive messaging. So when the campaign collapsed in 2019, many of these initiatives, including EM for PV, disappeared with little trace. So the absence of ethnic minorities from the anti-Brexit resistance cannot be reduced to chance. It reflects the structural whiteness of British society and also the persistence of class privilege within progressive politics. So while the Leave campaign successfully mobilized segments of minority voters by appealing to shared Commonwealth heritage or anti-immigration sentiment towards Eastern Europe, the Remain side largely failed to articulate an inclusive, multicultural vision of Europe. As a result, the Remain campaign not only lost a crucial segment of the electorate, but also missed the opportunity to redefine British Europeanism through the lens of diversity. So to conclude, my research shows that the Remain movement was indeed a white middle-class campaign, not by deliberate exclusion, but by structural reproduction of existing inequalities in political participation and representation. The late recognition of this fact by many activists, often summarized by the phrase, "we missed a trick," underscores the limits of the movement's self-perception as inclusive and progressive. Future pro-European or progressive mobilizations must take these lessons seriously. They must move beyond symbolic diversity and create spaces where minority voices are not merely invited, but actively shape the movement's agenda. So ultimately, the question of who speaks for Europe in Britain cannot be separated from the question of who gets to speak at all. After an interview with Black Europeans, so that was last week, so Black Europeans is a collective that represents minority ethnic citizens in Europe. The chair of the group, Ake Ashi, informed me that EU citizens of minority ethnic backgrounds, especially those with migration or immigrant origin, still face many of the same barriers, be they legal, with citizenship, residency, or settled status, but also social, with racism and the lack of recognition, and political, with obviously underrepresentation. So Ake Ashi founded the group Black Europeans in 2023, after years of trying unsuccessfully to engage EU institutions on issues affecting minority citizens. And his experience illustrates how ethnic minorities are often present but unheard within supposedly inclusive pro-European spaces. He describes attending meetings where he was the only Black participant among dozens, raising concerns that were heard but not listened to. For him, this shows that the EU's motto, "United in diversity," is only partially true. In practice, Europe remains united in white diversity. So Ake Ashi traces exclusion back to the Brexit era, when white EU citizens in the UK called themselves expats rather than migrants, distancing themselves from racialized communities such as refugees or asylum seekers. So this expat versus migrant divide made it difficult for Black and other minority Europeans to identify with the pro-European campaign or to see themselves represented within it. He also points to structural bias. Even highly qualified Black Europeans struggle to be taken seriously until a white person validates their idea. So this is like a personal story that he shared. Campaigns like the 3 Million or People's Vote rarely reached out to minority communities, reinforcing a sense that Europe is not for them. And finally, in response, so Black Europeans built his own platform its own platform, and created Euromec network, working directly with the EU delegation to give minority citizens a collective voice. So for Aki Ashi, true inclusion means amplifying minority voices, not speaking for them, and recognizing that Europe's diversity must include its Black and Brown citizens, whose presence is part of Europe's own history. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you very much. I have questions. Actually, I found this also very interesting. But does somebody want to ask a question first? Anyone? Okay, well, if that's all right with everyone, Marie, I'd like to ask you two questions. The first one is about Gina Miller, the campaigner, the anti-Brexit campaigner that I think is of BAME, to use a term which apparently is, well, for sure, is not very much appreciated by the people it's supposed to designate. But I mean, she is of Indian background, I think, or non-European and post-colonial background. And so the reason I mention her is because in a lot of your talk, you've tended to assimilate middle class and white. You've talked about the Remain campaigns have been white middle class. And so, but she is definitely middle class or even upper middle class. I think she's quite wealthy, sort of investment banker. I mean, originally, before she became known as a prominent campaigner for Remain, and so she managed to have a high profile, and she managed to play a very important role, despite being of Asian origin, because she's middle class. So she exemplifies, I think, that you can be an ethnic minority and have an impact if you're middle class. So maybe that would encourage us to unbundle perhaps the white middle class category. And maybe the people, one of the key reasons why ethnic minorities are excluded from these Remain campaigns is because they're working class to start with. That's just the question I'm putting to you. The example of Gina Miller makes me think of. Now, what was my second question? Yes. One of the I was thinking along what you were saying, looking for the reasons why ethnic minorities have felt excluded from the Remain campaigns, and I have, of course, it's impossible. I just have this idea that I'd like to suggest, which is the very specific situation of Britain in Europe regarding anti-discrimination laws against racial discrimination. Because I don't know, this took place a long time before Brexit, but around the late 90s, early 2000s, the European Union made a big push, passed a series of directives to make sure, or try to encourage as much as possible its member states to pass anti-legislation discrimination, by which I mean discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity in particular. And of course, Britain didn't need to be encouraged by the European at all. It already had one of the most, if not the strongest legislative framework for against racial discrimination since the 1960s and 70s. And in fact, a lot of the activism in Brussels around the European Union in favor of these directives had come from Dutch and British campaigners who were directly inspired by the policies that existed in their home country, that had existed for decades in their home countries. So in other words, the British ethnic minorities well, at least from that particular perspective of the history of anti-discrimination legislation, have never particularly looked to the European Union as something particularly protective or interesting, which could be viewed very differently if the question was raised in similar terms in countries like France or Germany or elsewhere.
Well, thank you for your questions, Romain. Well, regarding Gina Miller, Yes, you're right, saying that she's upper middle class and from you know, immigration, let's say, like my grandparents. So, but probably because I don't know, I didn't I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but I didn't really study her speeches or but I know that whenever I interviewed ethnic minority activists, they never mentioned, you know, high-profile politicians as a reference or a some sort of yeah, as you know, some people they could relate to in their everyday life, and like you said very rightly, most of them are from working class, not all of them, but I know that David Lammy was quite vocal during pro-European rallies, for example, and he's quite an important figure in the movement. But again, I think for most of them, from what they've told me, I mean, it's very different from what's happening on the ground and what's happening in politics, probably. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question. And regarding laws against racial discrimination, I don't really know. I don't know if I have an answer to that either, to be honest. But
Well, it's difficult to answer because
yeah,
it's a question about, you know, it's a question about why don't dogs bark at night? Because since there's no issue, well, compared to other European countries, ethnic minorities in Britain don't really have a need to campaign very much for legislation against racial discrimination because they've already got one, even though one can always argue, and one does, that more should be done to fight racial discrimination in Britain. But compared to other European countries, they have the best protection in Europe. So in that respect, there's just that just removes from the start one possible reason why they would mobilize for Remain.
yeah.
So it's difficult to, yeah. Sam, sorry, Nada, and then Sam.
Sorry,
Or
I
Sam, do you
didn't mean
wanted
to.
to
I was
react?
just registering, but I wanted to ask. You should finish. I didn't mean to. I wasn't an attempt to interrupt you. I was just saying, but I had another question. I'm also very happy for Nada to go ahead as well. I just wanted to be in the queue eventually.
Okay. So
Mine is
Marie,
not
if
a
you finish,
question.
Nada.
I'm
Yeah.
just following on Romain's comment. Yes, true that the European directives of 2001 and 2003 are a direct translation of the 1976 Race Relation Act, clearly introducing this notion of indirect discrimination, even of ethnic monitoring in the European legislation and normally to all other European countries. And when I was interviewing members of ethnic minorities in Britain, the vision that they had of Europe, and in France in particular, as being also representative of Europe, is a very racist country. At least this is the feedback I received, even though I wasn't asking the question directly, but it came up in a way or another that France and Europe in general are not doing enough to fight against discrimination, whether Britain was doing the right thing. So yes, probably I do share Roman's comment that this might also explain why they were not that vocal, or they did not see what Europe could bring in terms of legislation against discrimination. But an important element is also, if they are not British citizens but ethnic minorities, Britain leaving Europe meant that they could no longer come to Europe and travel inside Europe if they don't have the British nationality. So this has not been used as an element in the Remain campaign, even though it could have been an important element in the Remain campaign. So it wasn't a question, as I told you, it was just a comment. Thank you for your presentation, Marie.
Sam, you had a question.
I did, yeah. Well, first, thank you, Marie. It's really, really interesting talk and a really interesting problem and question one that it has occurred to me before. I wanted to. Well, I just wanted to mention, I guess, on the discussion that we were just having, that Britain's biggest crisis of race relations occurred really in the early 1980s, after the passage of the various different race relations acts from the early 1960s to the mid 1970s. The era of the 1981 uprisings in British cities, particularly Liverpool, but also in London, Manchester, and the sort of nadir of kind of race relations in Britain, if you like, was after this. Whether there was a sense that people of color in Britain felt that this architecture of legislation had improved their quality of life, potentially, in contrast to places in the continent, but those kinds of comparisons don't always work. I wanted to ask, so you have, Marie, a series of very compelling explanations that run through the ways that the people's vote movement worked and functioned on the ground. Its inability to meaningfully bring on board and reach out to different communities of color. But I wanted to suggest two other things. I guess so the first would be, I think about, there's a very famous interview of the wonderful British black theorist Stuart Hall in 2000, where he says that he feels like in the year 2000 he can just about see himself as British, but he can't yet see himself as English or Irish or Scottish, or the black communities can't yet make those kinds of more provincial claims. That Britishness had been, after an enormous amount of work and activism in a way that was very fragile, in a way that I think would probably then fall apart again in the early 20th century, something that had been, could be reclaimed. I'm not sure whether the European kind of cosmopolitan identity organized by the People's Vote campaign was ever an identity that became fully available to people of color. But particularly as I think that what a lot of that vision of cosmopolitanism was it was a cosmopolitanism of frictionless white mobility behind a series of militarized border controls that ran along the Mediterranean rather than the British Channel, right? But I also, my main question was about something really specific that was very specific to British politics during the time you were talking about, and that is that one of the main the main libidinal drive behind a lot of Remain politics was articulated against the Conservative Party and against Brexiteers, but it was also organized against the left of the Labour Party as organized by Jeremy Corbyn, right? There was this was when Jeremy Corbyn, a sort of a left-wing insurgent, was in charge of the Labour Party, and the People's Vote campaign, their energy and their innovation was mobilized. It felt in some ways almost as much against the Labour Party for not doing enough to try and stop Brexit as it was to be organised against the Brexiteers that precipitated it. But the thing that was quite specific as a moment, is that Corbyn's Labour Party was enormously successful in recruiting and organising people of color, and in fact, there was a really massive groundswell of support, South Asian and Black communities for Corbyn, that was extremely organic. And so in some senses, the big political fault line between the sort of liberal centre and the left ran through Brexit, but also more specifically through the for or against Jeremy Corbyn moment, right? And I felt this. For me, as someone putting my cards on the table, I still am, a Corbyn supporter, a creature of the left. I felt politically alienated from a People's Vote campaign that was pretty explicitly organized also against my politics, despite the fact I voted Remain, and didn't like Brexit, right? And I think, anecdotally, talking to friends of mine who are people of color in similar boats to me in terms of that political distinction, that felt very powerful. And I wonder if in a different situation, there, you know, that might have been something quite specific to that moment. I wonder if you had thoughts on that, Marie. Sorry, that question was way too long, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you, but no, I don't know. I know it was when I was there was during the Labour conference that was in 2018, I think, in Liverpool. There was a massive, there was a big march organized by the People's Vote, and I know there was some let's say frictions within the the main body of the march, because some of the activists were, like you said, against Jeremy Corbyn's stance on Europe, and they were like booing Jeremy Corbyn at at the beginning of the march. And there was this other side of the march which really wanted to support the Labour Party. So even within the organization, there were frictions and divisions as to should we support the Labour Party or should we say what we think, and that they should support the Remain cause. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, but as from my experience on the ground, that's what I observed.
I mean, maybe, sorry, just very quickly, just to put it another way, like everyone I know who voted Remain in 2016 went on two different paths. Half of the people I know would be explicitly anti-Corbyn, People's Vote people who were rallying around the EU flag, and the other half were very, very critical of that, frustrated by the Brexit becoming a wedge issue, and were door knocking for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. And these groups did not talk or overlap. And everyone I know who was a person of color went with the Jeremy Corbyn route, right? Because of the huge success of the Labour Party in mobilizing around things like border violence, prisons, police brutality, structural inequality, things like that, which was hugely powerful, particularly in London's Black community. And so I think a really big explanation for this is that the specificities of that conjuncture and the People's Votes campaigns derision towards what was probably one of the biggest organizations of people of color in a political party sense in modern British history.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really know sorry, what to say about Jeremy Corbyn politics and the the attitude of people of color. And no, sorry, I don't know.
Sorry, yeah, don't worry.
Vincent, you had a question?
Yeah, well, more of a series of remarks or reactions to your very interesting talk, of course, and to the remarks made by Nada and Romain. I think that indeed totally agree with Romain about and Nada about the sort of level of faith that ethnic minority people have, despite the obviously the persistent inequalities they suffer, but sort of level of confidence they have, or they had at least at some point, in the ability of the state to fight discrimination through a specific legislation. So I agree with that. That's a lot was done, obviously, in the 1960s, 70s. And what you mentioned, Sam, about the 1980s as having been probably the greatest, the period of greatest racial unrest in contemporary history is true. But my own interpretation is that these riots, as they were called by the conservative press, and these uprisings, as the left called them, were actually acted as catalysts for the implementation of the provisions of the legislation passed in 1960s and 70s. That is, a lot of the provisions of the 1976 Race Relations Act did not materialize until that series of uprisings in Bristol in 1980, Brixton 1981, and so on and so forth. So yes, of course, these inequalities were very obvious then, but I think the full extent of the legislation passed under Labour in the 1960s and 70s came to the fore in the 1980s. And interestingly, it was, Labour-dominated local authorities that actually pioneered, very often in terms of putting in place a series of measures locally in order to accommodate at least some of the needs expressed through these uprisings. So that's what I wanted to say. Then concerning class, I think I tend to agree with Romain. I think what was central to the, as I perceive it at least, to the Remain campaign is class. And in fact, those who voted Remain were not just theoretical pro-Europeans. There were, as Sam said, cosmopolitan people, well-traveled people who drink maybe French and Italian wine, who travel extensively to Europe, So that, and I think that excluded, a lot of ethnic minority people who had not reached that obviously middle class status. And I think, Marie, that one, although you didn't mention it, I think that the leader of Liverpool for Europe herself is actually
of Chinese descent.
half Chinese. Yes. So what is central is the fact that she reached, I suppose, middle class status, like other people. That's what I wanted to say. And I had one question about Black Europeans. You mentioned Ake Achi, right? So the organization was founded in 2023. Was it founded locally in Liverpool, or was it founded in London nationally or elsewhere? Because I'm not sure I got that bit.
It's online. It's a Facebook group mainly. So they don't really have they're not.
Is it British?
It is.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Right, we have 5 minutes left. So, Marie, do you want to take the opportunity to react to Vincent's comments and questions, or does anybody have a very, very ultimate question before we must finish the session?
I don't know if I have more questions. No.
I don't see any.
No. Well, maybe we could we can end the webinar if no one has any more questions.
Maybe we could add that the next session will be on the 3rd of November.
Yes.
2 p.m. French time, and it'd be actually chaired by Juliette Sartel from Crewe and Sorbonne Nouvelle University, and the session will be centered on grime, I think.
That grime music and anti-racism and citizenship. Yeah.
So very interesting.
Yeah, we look forward to that as well. Different angle, but converging issues there.
Indeed.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks in particular to Sam Wetherell and to Marie Perrière for sharing their great research with us.
Yes.
It was very, very stimulating and enlightening in a lot of different ways. So thanks a lot to you both, and thanks to you, Marie, in particular, for, as Sam said at the beginning, getting us together and giving us the opportunity to discuss your research. It's great. Thanks a lot to both of you.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was so great. Thank you. Lovely meeting you guys.
Thanks. Good touch.
Same here. Yes. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you next
Bye
time.
for now.